Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride, and joining me tonight is Ellen Hofer from EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland, and our friend of the show, Day Tucker, farmer and rural leader. And how are you tonight, folks?
Good, thank you. Yep, good.
Excellent. Well, our first story tonight is on the Labour manifesto launch. Jeremy Corbyn launched the manifesto today, promising an investment blitz that would leave no corner of the UK untouched. At the centre of the manifesto, called "It's Time for Real Change," is a large increase in public investment, funded by increased taxes on corporations and top earners. The SNP, however, has said Labour can't be trusted. SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford said, "On the face of it, Labour's manifesto reads like a copy and paste of the SNP's record in government, borrowing and imitating policies that the SNP has already delivered and offering little new to people in Scotland. Yet scratch the surface and just like the Tories, Labour is also proposing devastating and muddled plans that could see Scotland dragged out of the EU against our will, impose new nuclear weapons on the Clyde, inflict catastrophic harm to Scottish jobs, living standards, public services and the economy, and fails to recognise that the decision on when Scotland should have the right to choose our future is for the people of Scotland." So, what did we make of the Labour manifesto today then? Have you read it all yet?
I have read some of it. What I can gather, it's actually not a bad manifesto. It's quite progressive and it's quite aggressive. Good on England. I'm not sure it's going to deliver anything for Scotland as far as I can see. The SNP line on this is not all that far off, and Scotland has many of the things already promised in this manifesto going for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of interesting things. One that would affect Scotland certainly is the introduction of a real living wage of at least £10 an hour. But things like building 150,000 new council houses clearly isn't going to affect Scotland. Scotland is already well ahead of the game on that. Day, have you had much chance to look at this yet? And what did you think?
Haven't read anything, but funnily enough, I did have it on this morning when I was doing other work. And I did hear most of his speech. And like Ellen, I came to a very similar conclusion. A lot of it we are doing already. It will be a major change, which is what he wants, and actually what the country needs. We need change. Whether we need as radical a change, I think you may well get some of it backed by voters, perhaps not all of it.
It's an interesting question. I mean, there's a certain sense, I think, that we have kind of polarised more as a country, certainly in England. Both on the Brexit question and right-left, the right-left divide. Do you think, Ellen, that this kind of radical left manifesto can appeal to people?
I think it should appeal to people then, because the right line on things is becoming more and more proven to be just ineffective. It isn't delivering for people. Poverty is rising and we're not really getting out of the hole that we entered in, I think, 2008, where the whole austerity policies started coming to the fore. It just, what the right has delivered so far is not delivering for the people. It's delivering for the very few. Yeah. And so Labour is kind of cutting where they need to cut. Whether this will be enough to gain them the majority support that they require to get into government is very doubtful.
Yeah, and Day, this we know from years of opinion polling that things like nationalisation of railways and things like that, things that are long-standing policies of the left, are very popular even amongst Tory voters.
Yes.
But yet Jeremy Corbyn, who's proposing some of these big changes, is still up to 10, 15 points behind the Tories in the polls.
Yes.
Is there a problem with Labour, or is it Jeremy Corbyn, or is there some other problem you think that is stopping these policies cutting through?
I think it's with Jeremy Corbyn, sadly. And he was vilified right from the start, absolutely slated, the way Alex Salmond was by the British press. And they did exactly the same critique of Jeremy Corbyn, painting him as radical and traitor and all the rest of it. And that does stick in people's minds. he has a difficult battle to fight to get over that in the first place. And he doesn't have, I know he's terribly popular with the youngsters, and he can go to a pop concert and stir them up and get lots of support there. But for the majority of ordinary middle-of-the-road voters, I don't think he fires them up.
Why do you think that is? I mean, these are kind of traditional firebrand kind of policies, and he is quite a, when he's on the campaign trail, he is quite an exciting speaker. He does get a lot of energy in his meetings. Where is he falling down, Ellen?
I think it's not just Jeremy Corbyn. I think it's generally a Labour issue that they have not taken a clear, practical stance on Brexit.
Yeah.
They didn't do it soon enough. And even now, with the whole compromise that they're offering in terms of if we get into government, we'll go to the EU, we'll renegotiate within a couple of months, we will have a people's vote. This is not a very easy election promise. It's unrealistic. The EU has said they're not intending to renegotiate, though they have moved slightly by redefining some of the red lines that were there before. But Labour doesn't really, it isn't appealing to the Remainers with the same intensity that they need to in order to counter what the Tories have going for them at this point, and that is nothing but a very clear stance on we're going to get Brexit done. For those that do not want to get Brexit done on a UK-wide stage, they don't really have anybody to go for at this point. And so I think Labour is struggling in that regard. I also think that the popular support that Corbyn used to have from the youngsters has very much waned. So I think Labour has an issue with leadership, but not just a person leader, but also a moral stance and taking leadership on that. In that way, I actually think that this manifesto is quite groundbreaking for them. It sounds like a manifesto that is based on what the party membership wanted, and that is always to be welcome. If it's enough, I'm not sure.
And there is one specific pledge that I wanted to ask you about, this idea of giving EU nationals in the UK an automatic right to stay, looking at expanding rights for EU nationals in the UK. What, as you're, in your role as creative director of USIS, what do you make of this policy?
Well, it's a policy that should actually be a no-brainer. The promise, even from the Leave campaigners, was that nothing's going to change for EU citizens in the UK. Up until now, there was no issue with EU citizens staying here, so those that now should be required to get granted some sort of leave, it should be an automatic right. The Scottish Government has been calling for it for years. Various campaign groups, including the Free Million, have made clear that this should be an interesting way to go about it. Even people from the Conservative Party, I seem to remember that, Costa?
Oh yeah, Alberto Costa, yeah.
Roberto Costa also said that it should be a declaratory system rather than having settled status. It's kind of a no-brainer. It does make me feel kind of cynical. When I think of Labour and immigration, I will never forget the image of the controls on immigration mugs. And I think they still haven't really come up with a proper policy for that. However, as part of the manifesto, they also mentioned that they wish to have equal voting rights for all residents of the UK. And residents is very different from citizens. So that is something that I think we should be keeping an eye on. There's a litmus test happening here because the Scottish Government will be voting on the electoral franchise bill either this month or at the beginning of next month before the winter break. And Labour will be in the position to make this bill pass or leave it to not pass. The bill is required to achieve a supermajority of 66%. So Labour will be the kingmakers here, and according to the manifesto that was released today, nothing in the electoral franchise bill in Scotland should be something that Labour cannot support. So actually the Labour manifesto goes further and calls for automatic registration. So I'm really interested to see how this vote goes. It's a game of very, very high stakes.
Yeah, and of course there is a fairly long-standing bit of tension between Labour in England and Labour in Scotland. How do you think this manifesto is going to play in Scotland compared to how it will the reaction it'll get in England?
I don't think it will have the same impact because we have a different focus. I think we're way ahead of what they're talking about. And we just want to get on with getting Scotland working, hopefully for independence. But the thing that strikes me is, why has it taken over 3 years for these parties to come to these moral conclusions? I mean, if you think about Theresa May at one of her party conferences 2 ago, I think it was, and she was so anti-immigrant. And the Labour Party were not much better at it, and it's taken them all this time. Is it because they have had to wait for public opinion to move as things have been exposed? Do you think?
Well, Theresa May for me is a red flag in many ways. She was the Home Secretary at the time.
Yeah.
She was the one who introduced the hostile environment. I think in terms of Brexit and generally politics becoming more and more right-wing in the UK, immigration has just been the topic. One of the things that played into that was the refugee crisis and people conflating migrants with refugees. Personally, I don't have a problem with either group, but once you start modelling and othering both groups,
yes,
we're starting to get into trouble. The fact that they have now found a moral stance is very much down to the fact that people are starting to realise that EU citizens specifically, but migrants in general, are huge economic contributors.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to be cynical about this, but that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, but that's something that we tried to get over right from the very start in Scotland. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon was the first one to stand up and say, you are welcome. And she's continued to say it throughout these last three and a half years. But it's taken so long for them to come round to either realising it or realising that if they don't change their stance, then they won't get any votes.
Well, as Jeremy Corbyn launches this manifesto to end austerity, the Home Secretary has said that the government is not responsible for poverty in the UK. Priti Patel attempted to absolve people in Westminster from blame over deprivation across the country and instead highlighted the role of local authorities in education services, which of course receive the bulk of their funding from central government. Well, it's appalling, and of course, but everybody, and it's not just people in Westminster, it's not just at a national level, it's at a local level, she said during a campaign visit to Barrow-in-Furness, when she was questioned about how 2 in 5 children in some local areas were born into poverty. Challenged that the government was responsible for poverty and that the Tories had had almost 10 years to address the issue, Patel replied, "It's not the government though, is it? Everybody that says the government as if it is this sort of bland blob that, you can just go and blame." The SNP's social justice spokesperson condemned the comments, and Neil Gray warned that the remarks highlighted the hard-right takeover of the Tory party and the danger that it posed to Scotland. Mr Gray said Priti Patel's callous comments go right to the centre of this heartless Tory government, who despite inflicting a decade of devastating austerity and regressive welfare policies, leading to a rise in poverty and food bank use, shifted the blame onto schools and local councils. And it does seem a little bit hypocritical for a government that has led the austerity charge, has cut funding to local councils across the country. It does seem somewhat ridiculous for them to now claim that they're not responsible for poverty, despite poverty rising significantly during the course of the last 10 years. So what are we
That's the Tory game, though, the blame game.
What do you make, Alan?
Priti Patel is an exceptional person, really worth examining every single word that she says. This homogenous blob that she speaks of, government is something that you can always blame it on. Oh no, it's at local level. Local level that is underfunded significantly by the governments. Also, if you're going to go down that route of argument that, poverty is not something that government can touch, hell, why do we need a government then?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's a good question. Meanwhile, the Tories also set up a website purporting to showcase Labour's manifesto, but which instead attacks the party's policies. just days after the party faced criticism for misleading the public with a similar stunt. The official Tory Twitter account posted a link to the website, which displays a picture of Jeremy Corbyn looking confused using the URL labourmanifesto.co.uk. The website, coloured in Labour red and registered only 3 days ago, states, Labour's 29 manifesto, no plan for Brexit, higher taxes, 2 more referendums. The Conservatives had apparently paid for a Google advert, which meant internet browsers were directed to the website when they searched for Labour. It comes after the Conservatives prompted widespread criticism, including from Twitter, after the party rebranded one of its official Twitter accounts to make it look like a fact-checking service during the ITV leaders' debate last night. And this kind of disinformation on the internet, I mean, this is the kind of fake news that we're all supposed to be concerned about, and yet here's the party of government
indulging in it,
throwing out clearly kind of false advertising,
yes,
if you like.
Yes.
What are we supposed to do with this? I mean, is there anything we can do about this?
I mean, how do we even contemplate conducting a general election if this is the tactics that can be freely indulged in?
Yeah.
The thing that really shocks me is the brazenness of it all. I mean, changing the name of your Twitter account still doesn't change your @ address, so it is pretty clear who's behind that. For the Conservatives to now go about the Labour manifesto website, we're really going to the bargain basement of terrible campaign tactics.
Yeah.
It is everything that we in Scotland are hoping to get rid of. I think it just summarises the lack of a good argument. The Conservatives have nothing going for them other than taking down what they see as their main opposition. It's quite interesting because actually Labour is not being the opposition that it could be and still seems to be the best sort of target for the Conservatives, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting that the hit that the Tories, and Boris Johnson did this several times at the debate the other night, is this focus on 2 referendums. They're saying basically vote Labour, get another Scottish independence referendum, which may play very differently in Scotland than it plays down south. But it's odd, I think, isn't it, Dave, that we're seeing the Tories putting such a focus on Scottish independence as some sort of threat that has to be avoided by voting Tory, when we know that Tory voters would happily jettison Scotland if it meant they got the Brexit they wanted.
Yes, and without the Tories, Scottish independence might not be quite at such a high level. It's because of them and because of Boris Johnson that the rise in numbers who are prepared to vote for independence has happened.
And I mean, it's probably false anyway, since Labour have said that there will be no independence referendum in their first term of government.
Now, was that at breakfast or at lunch or at tea time?
Well, it has varied a little bit. At one point, Corbyn said at least not in the first couple of years, but it seems like there are voices off telling him to say not at all within the first term. And what again, this both parties are saying no independence referendum for Scotland, really under any circumstances. The Tories have taken a slightly harder line saying no, nay, never. Labour are just saying no, not in the next 5 years. But what are people in Scotland, do you think, going to make of that kind of language coming out of the London parties?
I think it's quite interesting, the exact argument that they're using, that, you shouldn't have another referendum. If we applied that to the Brexit referendum, hey, you guys had a referendum on joining the EU as well. Why did we have another one in the first place? The issue was decided. The very fact that the unionist parties are asking or are stating that there shouldn't be a referendum proves the point that Scotland needs to have control over its own affairs. Its opinion is not only not wanted, it is actively suppressed. And that is, I think we're at a very different point to 2014. In 2014, we were still arguing for an independent Scotland based on a sort of hopeful vision. At this point, it's kind of making the case for itself. And it's not Scotland that's making a case for independence, it's the Union that is making a case for independence.
And it's also making the case that it's not us that they love and want to keep. It's our assets.
Yes.
You know, without our assets, they really are gubbed this time because they've damaged the economy to such an extent.
Yeah, and I thought it was especially interesting at the debate the other night. Boris Johnson said that this was a once-in-a-generation election,
Yes.
which presumably, by Tory logic, means that we're going to have no more elections for the next 30 years. So that's an interesting one.
Now, I read something on Twitter that it's 7 years. The 7 years is what they mean by a generation.
Well, 7 years is the
Political.
is the time between referendums if there were to be a vote in Northern Ireland
Right.
on Irish unification. The
Right.
Good Friday Agreement says that if there is a referendum and it fails, then another one couldn't be held for 7 years.
For 7
So
years, right.
That's perhaps where that idea is coming
Right.
from.
Which is perhaps why 2020 is such a crucial year for Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah, well, 2021, of course, with the Scottish elections, would be 7 years since the last referendum. So that would match up
I
with.
believe that also ties in with the Labour line that not now, maybe later.
Yeah.
I think they're hoping for maybe later after 2021, assuming that the
Right.
Scottish government will not stay in the current form that it is, or in any form whatsoever, given that Brexit really threatens our constitutional rights and that the Scottish Parliament was built on EU legislation that will fall away with Brexit.
Anyway, moving on. The SNP's deputy Westminster leader has slammed the Lib Dems for admitting that they would keep the Tories and Boris Johnson in government. In an interview with Robert Peston, Lib Dem deputy leader Ed Davey admitted his party would prop up a minority Tory administration and allow Boris Johnson to remain as Prime Minister by choosing to vote on an issue-by-issue basis rather than working with the SNP and Labour to kick the Tories out of government. Asked by Peston, "You've just said that you expect Boris Johnson to lead the largest party after this election but not have a majority, and on that basis you expect him to form the government." Ed Davey responded, "We'll vote issue by issue, and if Boris Johnson, as the polls suggest, is heading a minority Conservative government, we'll vote against anything that we disagree with that he puts forward." SNP Deputy Westminster Leader Kirsty Blackman said, "The cat is out of the bag with this jaw-dropping admission that the Lib Dems haven't changed a bit from their Tory coalition days and would do it all over again by propping Boris Johnson up in government if they get the chance. The Lib Dems cannot be trusted." And, I mean, the Lib Dems took such a hit politically from their support for the Tories in the 2010 election. What do you think they hope to gain from this very hard line against working with the other parties and seeming to constantly lean to the right? What's the political gain there for them, do you think?
I think anything to get power, really. But if you look at Jo Swinton, I think it's a no-brainer that this woman is willing to say or do anything that will get her into a position of greater power. It's not about the coalition partners, it's who's going to get her there.
And interesting, her popularity is waning now, according to the polls. So people are beginning to see through her. It was quite interesting in the early days when she sort of rose to the top, and all the people who were fed up with the Conservatives but were prepared to listen to Jo Swinson and thought she was the bee's knees. And if you dared to criticise Jo Swinson and remind them what she had done and what her voting record was, they couldn't cope with that on Twitter at all. And now...
Yeah. I think that's actually a very valid point, the fact that she has voted more like a Tory than like her own party politicians is a very telltale sign. The people that I interact with on a UK-wide scale in regards to citizens' rights, for the last couple of years, at least in the beginning, for them, the Lib Dems were the very clear first choice for whom they wanted to run the government. They didn't trust Labour because of the whole controls on immigration thing. But I can see that the mood is changing there. People are starting to question very severely. And just recently I saw a post from Guy Verhofstadt praising and kind of trying to help push Jo Swinson from his European basis. And if you looked at the comments underneath the tweet that he put out, it was fascinating to see that people whom I had pegged as lifelong Lib Dem supporters were going, hang on, not that woman.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the political strategy seems strange as well. The Lib Dems are the most explicitly pro-EU of the UK-wide parties. The Tories are clearly strongly pro-Brexit. And Labour are now promising, at the very least, a second referendum with Remain as an option. Why do you think the Lib Dems think they can work better with the Tories on this, especially given that this is the key issue in the election? Why are they...
Because of the hatred that Jo Swinson has for Jeremy Corbyn. She and a lot of them are exactly the same. And it's power, as you mentioned, Ellen. She's after power.
Well, I also think that there's something to be said for in what position does it put your party in coalition? In coalition with the Tories, the Lib Dems would become the mitigators, or they would see themselves as the mitigators of very bad policies or very damaging policies. In a coalition with Labour or any other party, they would be much less in that role. So it's a much more flattering light to see yourself in as the mitigator of Tory austerity, blah, blah.
Of course, you know...
It didn't help them the last time, though, did it?
They will have the student fee hangover for another couple of decades, I reckon.
Yeah. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, the cost of Brexit will be paid by those who can afford it least, Nicola Sturgeon has said, highlighting the urgent need to escape Brexit and put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. Scottish Government analysis has found that a no-deal scenario could push 130,000 Scots into poverty. As the Tories have ruled out extending the transition period past 2020, there is now a very real prospect that the UK eventually crashes out without a permanent deal, even if Johnson's deal is passed. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has previously warned of price rises, falls in real wages, lower employment and lower tax revenues, and said the areas with high levels of child poverty are highly exposed to changes in trade with the EU and the potential loss of EU funding. Ms Sturgeon said, "A vote for the SNP is a vote to escape Brexit and put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit and we shouldn't have to pay the price in jobs and household incomes. People like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg don't have to worry about the impact their Brexit chaos will have on the cost of living. The biggest impact will be borne by those who can least afford it. In a no-deal scenario, 130,000 people in Scotland could be pushed into poverty, and if Boris Johnson is re-elected, that wouldn't be the end of Brexit, it would only be the beginning." And we've heard this kind of analysis multiple times over the last few years, and yet it just doesn't seem to be getting through to people who are leavers. The threats of serious economic harm, which we're already seeing.
But it hasn't affected them yet, possibly. And also, somebody told me that the PPI money, all those billions that are sitting in the banks, isn't sitting there statically. It's being offered to people as loans. So they're going to probably the same people who got themselves into this situation in the first place by taking out loans are having to go back to the banks to get more loans, supposing they've managed to recover, and they're going back for more loans of their own money. It's shameful. And this person told me that actually the economy will it'll be floating on this money for quite some time, and it'll give the illusion that the economy is doing quite well. But it's money that belonged to individuals like you and I, and it should come back to us instead of it's gone back to the banks to lend it again.
Yeah, what do you think, Alan?
I'm reflective about the fact that just this year we had a UN report coming into the UK absolutely condemning the austerity politics that have come out of Westminster for the last couple of years, having led to hundreds of thousands of people being in serious trouble, passing away from, illnesses, from impoverishment. It's not to be underestimated. I think, though, if we're looking at Scotland, the whole bumbling about independence and waiting and seeing and tying our cart to Brexit also leads to the fact that we have an incredible rise in homelessness, in people being on the streets, and people being dipped into poverty in and out, as long as we can go. The longer Scotland waits and ties its cart to Brexit, the longer we are able to forget about the fact that actually, at the minute, the majority of the population is not impacted by Brexit. They're impacted by Westminster austerity policies. And we have the opportunity to do something about that. Now, it sounds a bit like, oh, why should we cry over spilt milk? But we could have gone on our way of evening the path for independence way earlier, and that would put us into a much better position now. We have to tick boxes. I think we all agree on that. There are democratic boxes that need to be ticked. That could have been ticked years ago.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it is worrying. I think to hear 130,000 people. That's a big chunk of the Scottish population who are currently above the poverty line that could be pushed below it just by this act of Brexit. And I think there is something there about the fact that people don't really know what's going to happen. We heard all these dread predictions before the referendum, which I think were ill-advised. George Osborne talking about needing an emergency budget that was going to slash everything, and of course that never happened. So now I think is there maybe a wee bit of a boy who cried wolf about the whole thing, where people now just think, oh no, they said it was going to be terrible and things are okay just now.
But they're already saying that. They've been saying that for quite some time. The Bank of England forecast was incorrect, and the OBR and all the rest, it hasn't happened. I just think they are kidding themselves.
I think in a climate where we're facing so much disenfranchisement and disillusionment with politics, it's much easier to look to a potential future of sunlit uplands than to engage your imagination when it comes to the real consequences. Again, most of the population here are not yet affected by Brexit. This is a whole different picture for especially EU citizens and their families who are already severely impacted. In a way, I wish that people understood what that means, what the difference is. I'm sure people would stop voting for Christmas as the turkey's sitting in the oven. But we're not there, and sometimes it's much more pleasant, especially if you're disengaged, if you're frustrated and fed up with whatever is going on. And I'm sure that can happen not just to, the everyday man and woman on the street, but even people who are seriously politically engaged. All of us get sick and tired of this Brexit thing. In that case, it's much easier to think about all the fantastic things that we could do and harking back to, nostalgic memories of how we all got through the war and dig for victory and all that. The world has changed tremendously, but fantasy is still more appealing than reality that you can't quite understand yet, and that you really don't want to waste your imagination on, because it's going to be you in that situation fairly soon. The thing that it reminds me of is actually Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany starting to run out of money increasingly just before Germany reunited, and what the government of Eastern Germany started doing was trying to find the most imaginative ways to find money, from weapons trading with embargoed countries to all the antiques that were stored in warehouses that people were brought across the border, shipped into a warehouse, and whole warehouses bought up to make money available to the government. It's that kind of situation that we're heading into. That's what happens when you cut yourself off from your economic and social trading partners.
And there's certainly a big rural dimension to Brexit that probably doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, EU funding is a key part of the rural economy.
Absolutely.
How much of this poverty do you think will be visited on farmers and rural communities?
Well, it's already impacted. There are loads of farms that have gone out of business, not just because they're perhaps inefficient, but because they're the EU funds that they were getting. In 2005, I think it was, they started to lower them, because the aim from the EU was to stop giving direct payments to farmers by 2020. And that still is the aim. Farming will still be supported, but not with direct payments to individual farmers. So they've had that. They've had a kind of they've got used to that kind of thing. But now with the trade things and the fact that sheep farming is going to be impacted most of all, and sheep farming is very important in Scotland as it is in Wales, that is beginning to hit home. And I farm, I think, reasonably successfully, and I've got a good outlet. My lamb goes to Marks and Spencer, so we try and be the best for the best outlets in a niche market. And niche markets are always a bit less affected than everybody else. But the markets, when you're selling lamb, it's going up and down. There can be, in 1 week, there can be a 10 to 20 pound difference per head of sheep when you're selling
That's huge.
your livestock. And it's always been volatile, but it's never been quite as volatile as this. And coming up to the deadline, the Brexit deadline that Boris set himself, the lambs were pouring into the market because farmers wanted rid of them as quickly as they could, whether they were ready or not. And that distorted the market. So anybody that has managed to hang on to their lamb, they may find that they're actually going to be okay because there will be a shortage.
It's quite interesting because when we remember that big red lie on the big red bus, the 350 million per week not going to the EU, but that's what they said. Out of the funds that we're currently sending to the EU, the whole fact that the lie was that this would be going to the NHS, but actually the UK receives money back, especially for agriculture, that they have already withheld from Scotland for quite some time and then keep re-announcing as, we're extra funding for the Scottish farmers. But actually none of that money, let's
get this in perspective. You mentioned that 350 million. Can you remember the figure that the Westminster government kept back from Scottish farmers that had been awarded to them by the EU to bring us up to the average level of EU farms? It was, I think it has shrunk. It's down to 160 million. Well, that's just over half what Boris was complaining about.
Yeah. Well, and out of that money, the money that we receive back it just can't be completely invested in the NHS. The UK government has said that it will replace any funding that came from the EU and will pay for it. So out of the 350 million lies that they just told, not even all of those lies will be applied to the areas that they are currently being spent on.
We will move on now. I'm sure we could talk about this a lot longer. Brexit is one of those subjects. But in Washington, the impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump was due to hear from 2 further key witnesses today who are expected to add to the growing evidence that the Trump administration pressured Ukraine for political gain. Fiona Hill, a National Security Council official who was the White House's top expert on Russia, will firmly reject the claim that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 US election, according to her opening statement. The assertion that Ukraine interfered on behalf of the Democratic Party in 2016 has been a central thrust of the Republican attack as it attempts to muddy the waters around the US-Ukraine relationship. The testimony comes a day after Wednesday's bombshell deposition from Gordon Sondland, the US ambassador to the EU, about the existence of a quid pro quo where Trump was willing to grant the Ukrainian president a White House meeting on condition he announced investigations into Trump's political rival, Joe Biden. So this is an ongoing story. It just keeps getting more and more kind of seemingly damning for Trump. And yet the enthusiasm for impeachment amongst the American people is pretty much divided along party lines, and the likelihood of actually impeaching Donald Trump with a trial in the Senate still looks like pretty much zero. What happens to a country when there just isn't a way to hold a politician accountable for potential crimes.
That's
We'll
right.
find out. Yeah, it's quite interesting because this impeachment case was brought, but I think it was kind of a means to an end. They were looking to for a way to impeach Trump. I'm sure there's 17 zillion approaches to this. Whether this one is the one that is going to break the camel's back, unlikely. But we're still holding our fingers crossed. I think in any case, we've now popped the impeachment cherry for Trump. Whether that means that further impeachment charges won't be brought is one of the things that remains to be seen. I think one of the things that really need to be looked at are his financial dealings and business dealings that are impacted by his presidency and vice versa. That would have been, for me, the most obvious route to go, but obviously the legal team decided that this was the more sensible case. Even though I'm interested in American politics, this is not one of the things that has kept me going, and it's quite interesting because I'd love to see Trump impeached, but it's not grabbing my imagination.
No. I think because we know it probably won't happen, because it will fail at the next stage on, but the outcome will be that he will be exposed and it will affect his vote, even though he may still win. It will decrease the vote, and I think that's what the Democrats were hoping for.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things though is to focus it on this issue around Joe and Hunter Biden, where I think even many Democrats look at that and go, well, even if it's not technically illegal, it still looks
dodgy,
a bit iffy. And I think to focus the challenge to Trump around an issue that kind of darkens the name of the person who's the current front runner to face him in the election seems like a really strange political decision.
It is a strange tactic.
Yeah, so I mean, with, as you say, so much else to attack Trump on, if you wanted to impeach him, there are plenty of other options you could have gone through. And at the same time, the trial in the Senate, if it goes ahead, will happen in January, which will take Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Kamala Harris, Senator Cory Booker, all these contenders for the presidency off the campaign trail. Just weeks before America starts voting for the Democratic nominee. It's a really strange situation to be in.
Yeah. Crucially, if you look at what's happening here with Boris Johnson and the Russian links, the two things are kind of rolling along together, and I'm just interested as to when there will be a crossover.
Well, I mean, there are some tendrils of this impeachment inquiry that do reach into Downing Street. Whether that ever comes into the actual evidence that's brought, we'll just have to wait and see. But moving on now, in Syria, at least 22 civilians have died after Syrian government shelling targeted a displacement camp and a hospital, as Bashar al-Assad continues to pound the last pocket of opposition-held territory in the country. The camp, hosting 7,000 people near the village of Ka in Idlib province, was hit by a ground-to-ground missile on Wednesday night carrying illegal cluster bomb submunitions. The attack killed at least 16 people, injured dozens more, and started fires which blazed through the flimsy tents in the camp. And this is just an ongoing horror in Syria. What do you think the international community should be doing at this stage to try and resolve the issues that are happening in Syria just now?
It's very hard to say. It's not only illegal weapons that were being used, they're being used in a human rights violation. You're not meant to shell hospitals or refugee camps. It is unthinkable, and to remain silent about it and to not make very clear steps about it, I think we're really letting each other down as human beings.
Yeah, this wave of attacks has now killed more than 1,300 people and created almost 1 million refugees in Syria. And there have been numerous of the attacks. I think it was 11 attacks on hospitals since April. Is there anything that we can do at this stage, given that Trump has withdrawn, at very short notice, the American troops that were in Syria? is there anything that we can still do, or do we just have to let it go?
I think one of the obvious points of contention here is, where are these weapons killing millions coming from? And if we are not the ones supplying them, should we be sanctioning those that are? Should we continue to be doing trade with those? It takes a very clear moral stance, and actually it's not that difficult to do. We have to be really consequent about it. If you don't want people to die under shellings like this, under killing sprees like this, stop supporting the infrastructure that makes it possible. It doesn't matter how much it's worth to the UK government or to any other European or any other, worldwide government. It shouldn't be happening.
Who benefits from disrupting that particular country, which is producing so many refugees, and where do those refugees head for? And that disrupts economies and people, and it's just, I keep thinking, Russia?
Yeah, certainly Russia is an ally of the Syrian leader. I think probably most people assume that the weapons are coming either from Russia or with Russian assistance at any rate. Meanwhile, in the Middle East still, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was today indicted for bribery, fraud and breach of trust. Avichai Mandelblit, the country's Attorney General, said today that the Prime Minister would be charged in all 3 major corruption cases for which he was investigated. The announcement follows 3 years of investigation and only adds to the challenges facing Netanyahu, who has failed to secure a clear win in 2 elections this year. The Prime Minister has denied all the allegations, saying they are part of a politically orchestrated witch hunt to oust him from office. Netanyahu has previously stated he would not resign if indicted. He is not legally required to do so unless convicted, a process that could take months or even years. The criminal case is also potentially tied to his political survival, as some of his parliamentary allies have suggested they would back laws to grant him immunity if he remains the country's leader. So these cases, they involve, as I said, bribery, fraud, and there's already a case. His wife was convicted in June of illegally misusing thousands of pounds of state money. Benjamin Netanyahu is not perhaps the most judicious leader in the world, although he has had a lot of electoral success in Israel. Again, we see a world leader involved in crimes, potentially, allegedly. And again, Netanyahu, a great friend and ally of Donald Trump. Is this something that we're just going to have to get used to seeing more and more of politicians
and of the Conservative Party?
Yeah. I mean, are we just going to have to get used to politicians basically thinking they can get away with murder?
Yep.
Not literal murder, I should stress. That's not one of the allegations.
At least not in this instance, potentially. I think we need to get used to the fact that not only are there leaders now publicly overstepping boundaries, we're actually starting to see democracies starting to catch up with these infringements on what should be right and lawful. But we are also seeing that these things are really struggling to get any traction, to remove leaders from office that shouldn't be there, that are abusing their power. I think it's going to be a really interesting development. How is our modern democracy, or our modern democracies, how are they going to respond to these issues in a much more timely fashion? It's, I think, up to our generation to do that, to think about these policies that will help do this. Because at the minute, we still cannot trust the voters to take these allegations as serious as they need to be taken in order to really constructively persecute people violating laws.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the issues in the Trump case, and I wonder, I mean, I don't know Israel well enough to guess, but the idea that when you start calling it a witch hunt, when you start saying they're just out to get me, it's all fake news, whatever, which seems to be Netanyahu's line of defense now. it does often seem to just embolden your own supporters to say, well, none of it's true, it can't be true, this is all made up. And so it becomes much, much harder to reach justice that people agree is justice.
Is justice, yes. We've only got to look at how the judges were treated when that was going
Brexit
on.
Decision, yeah.
Farage, he was the instigator, wasn't he? But where did he get it from? Was it Trump, or was it direct from Russia through Trump? You know, it's this little collective that's going. And Netanyahu is probably part of it as well.
It's actually a line of argument that Netanyahu is using in combination with a very militant sort of line. I think specifically when we talk about Palestine and how Israel is dealing or not dealing with Palestine. The same sort of way of arguing comes forth from him and has been coming forth from him his entire time in office. It's about, on the one hand, it's poor us. We're constantly persecuted, and on the other hand, it's we need to stand up for Israel. This is what we need to do to protect our. So it's appealing absolutely to the core voters of that party. It's not even reflecting outwards, because these are. I think my parents in a discussion would say that this is a conversation killer. At the point where you go, this is a witch hunt. It's very hard to be argued with, because everything is going to be turned into a witch hunt. No matter how reasonable the argument, how wrong you might be, at that point you've ended the conversation. You're just the victim. Victimizing others is not what you do as a victim from that perspective.
Yeah. Back in Scotland, former First Minister Alex Salmond appeared at the High Court in Edinburgh today in front of Lady Dorian, the Lord Justice Clerk, to face a total of 14 charges, including 1 of attempted rape, 11 of sexual and indecent assault. Outside the court, he told the media he was pleading not guilty to all the charges and would defend himself vigorously. Mr. Salmond said, "I'm not permitted to say too much today, save that we've lodged our defence statement in the court and pled not guilty to all charges. We're also in the midst of a general election campaign, and I'm not going to say anything that would influence that process." And unfortunately, we can't discuss this either. We can't say much more on this because it is, of course, all now sub judice. It's an ongoing court case. We will, of course, report as that case progresses. And finally, the majority of carers in Scotland will receive their next payment of the Carers Allowance Supplement on Friday, 13th of December, the day after the election. This supplement, paid twice a year by Social Security Scotland to carers in receipt of Carers Allowance in Scotland, is now in its second year. Payments have already been made to over 91,000 carers throughout Scotland. The Carers Allowance Supplement is 2 automatic payments totalling £452.40 this year. It was introduced by the Scottish Government because carers allowance was the lowest benefit paid by the UK Government. The additional payment means that it is now above the level of job seekers allowance. This year, the Scottish Government is investing over £320 million in carers allowance and carers allowance supplement. And Social Security Secretary Shirley Ann Somerville said, "I'm delighted that carers allowance supplement, now in its second year, has helped so many carers throughout Scotland. Carers make an invaluable contribution to society. This was the first payment we introduced, and we did so to acknowledge their vital role." And I mean, it's quite hard to disagree with this one, isn't it? Is this what carers need? Do they need more? Is this or is this the best they can get?
Absolutely, carers need more. Absolutely underfunded job and really underappreciated. If anybody has had to take care of somebody for 24 hours a day for an extended period of time will understand that this is a hugely emotionally and physically challenging role that they are carrying out to the great benefit of everybody else who's not carrying out that role. And that is not to say that people in need of carers are particularly complicated. It is just a really, really tough job. So this is the least that the Scottish Government can do. And I'm really grateful that they're doing it.
Yes. But again, it just shows the difference between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government, and the compassion that we have innately within the Scottish psyche, I think.
It specifically addresses the fact that it's often females that are carers, and females are obviously underpaid in a greater context of the economy in general, but specifically caring roles are very heavily carried out by females, and to have financial independence to some degree funded by the Scottish government is just something that really it's hard to disagree with. Why would you?
And in some cases, children.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of extraordinary to think that carers allowance in England is less than job seekers allowance, which is just £70 a week.
Jeez.
I mean, that is quite unbelievable when, as you say, it's one of the toughest jobs there is. And if people weren't doing it, the state would have to pay a lot more to get that same work done.
Try to privatize that sector, try to get that paid for through third contractors. You'd never get away with that low an amount to pay. No way.
Yeah.
You see, that's what this Westminster government has done. It has moved the financial burden from the state to people.
Yeah, well, as we say, that is good news for carers in Scotland. We would obviously love to see them get salaries in the hundreds of thousands. Maybe one day in the future. That is all we've got time for tonight, unfortunately. I'd like to thank Ellen and Dave so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you here. We also would like to thank you for joining us. We would tell you, as ever, though, making TV programmes is an expensive business. Just keeping the lights on here in the studio costs money, and it's money that we don't necessarily always have. So if you are able to afford it, do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. You can see it along the bottom of the screen there. And give your £5 a month. It would make all the difference in the world to the quality of programmes, the quantity of programmes, and the type of programmes that we can bring you here. We want to turn this into a full service television channel, but we can only do that with your support. So as I say, if you're able to, please support us. If you can't, don't worry, the programmes will always remain free to view. But if you've got any cash to spare, for example, if you are the kind of person who has cancelled a TV licence in the last few years, you've got a few extra quid to spend on the media, so put it towards the independent Scottish media that I think we all want to see flourish. But once again, thank you to Dave, thank you to Ellen. I've been Kenny McBride. We will be back on Sunday with the Full Scottish at 12, as always. But until then, thanks again for joining us, and good night.